Welcome to the Gorecki podcast. My goal with this podcast is to talk to interesting people about engineering, technology, and their experiences. My guest today is Dr. Simon Gilroy. Dr. Gilroy has his Ph.D. in Plant Biochemistry and is a Professor of Botany at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He runs the Gilroy Life Sciences Lab, which focuses on the way in which plants perceive and respond to their environment, from light and gravity to temperature and touch. Dr. Gilroy has published numerous studies on topics such as plant signaling, gene expression, and stress responses, and his work has been recognized with multiple awards and honors. He is also a passionate educator and communicator dedicated to sharing his knowledge and enthusiasm for plants with his students. In today's episode, we talk about how he became interested in how plants work in space and some of the things that his lab has discovered along the way. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoy this conversation with Dr. Simon Gilroy. Okay, Dr. Simon Gilroy. Basically, I became interested in your work because my girlfriend actually studied mechanical engineering at Madison, and she worked at Sierra Space and NASA, and she actually kind of turned me on to the whole like plants in space and how that was even a topic in the first place. And then I got introduced to your lab. And so if you could kind of give an introduction to who you are, what you studied, and kind of how you got to where you are today, I think that would be a great place to start.
Yeah, I mean, that would assume that there is like a logic behind it, and there totally isn't.
Oh, interesting.
I did my undergraduate degree in the UK, in Cambridge, and then went on and did a PhD in Scotland.
Oh, interesting.
And my PhD was with this guy, Tony Faravas. And Tony's sort of claim to fame is that he is the person who sort of has set the groundwork for the area of plant intelligence. Now, that is a terrible area, right? Because the word, like calling it plant intelligence, sets you thinking in the wrong way, because we know what we mean by intelligence, we know what human intelligence is, but that area of research is basically for plants is not that plants have a brain and think. It's that plants can take in information about the world around them, process it, and do just like remarkable things with that information processing. So that's sort of the background of where I did my PhD. But the kind of questions that we were interested in are, how does a plant know that the lights have come on? Or how does a plant know that the temperature has changed? Or how does a plant know that an insect is eating it? And then it doesn't have nerves, it doesn't have a brain, and so it can't process that information the same way we do. So how does it take in that information, and then kind of at a cellular level, how do the proteins and the cellular processes compensate for not having a brain? How does the information get processed using that machinery, which is going to be different from the way that we as humans do it?
Yeah, that's really interesting, because there's clearly some kind of response. Like it has to be able to understand stimuli and then what to do with that. And I think as humans, we have a really hard time when we see things that do that. We have a hard time trying to decide is that intelligence, or is that just a response, right? Is it going to do the same thing every single time based on the exact same stimuli, or is it adapting in some way? So that's really interesting. I don't know if you had more to add.
Yeah, no. But so the conundrum is that the language that we end up having to use to talk about that, and it's absolutely correct. Like, how are we going to talk about it? We're going to use the language that we use to describe how we work, because that's in reality, that's what we know. And so you start talking about plants thinking, but it's a total shorthand for just trying to say, oh, that's information processing. Or plant behavior, and then we think of like human behavior, and it's just saying that there is this signal response pathways which are built into the organism. So anyway, I did a lot of research on kind of a seeing is believing element of science, where you can, so the conundrum for understanding how plants operate is that we don't we operate by seeing things happen and then sort of understanding them. So we can understand, a puppy wandering around, and you can look at it and you can see its behavior and you can see it sniffing things, and you can go like, oh, I get what it's doing, and I can see it, oh, and it's happy, and all of the things that come from being able to observe the responses occurring in real time and mapping them into our world. Mm-hmm. And that works really easily. But then you look at a plant, and for many people, plants just don't do anything. You just look there and it's just sitting there. And there is this phenomenon, which is really interesting. It's called plant blindness. And it's a true phenomenon. And there's like research on it. And it is, so let's say that you are given a set of images of the world, right? And you've got the picture of like a mountainside, and you've got a picture of a field. But in the middle of it, in tiny, like maybe 3 or 4 pixels, is a puppy, right? And you ask people what they see in the pictures, they will go, I saw a puppy. And then you can go, but 99% of the stuff in that image was plants. Mm-hmm. And it's almost like you filter it out, just because they're so ubiquitous and they're everywhere, but they don't do the puppy thing. Right? They just, you look at them and they don't appear to be doing very much. And you think of them growing, and you think of, the timeframes that things are going to operate over is going to be years or months. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't fit in our world of behavior, because our world of behavior is your attention span is like a second. And
well, it's worse now.
That's not the time frame that it appears to us that plants are working in. And so one of the things that we still work on in the lab now, even 30 years after doing a PhD, is if you could work out how to see what the plant is doing and truly see it, visualize it, maybe that would let you understand a little bit more about what it means to be a plant and the dynamics of being a plant. And so it turns out there's a whole bunch of technologies which have got better and better and better over time, which let you effectively stick cameras in front of plants and see them doing what they're doing. Some of it is, you'll see nature documentaries, things like that, where they time-lapse plants so that you can bring their growth movements into the realm that we see things occurring at.
Yeah, and the time scale.
Yeah, but then there are other technologies that allow you to basically put sensors optical sensors inside the plant and visualize things that are going on in real time. And that has opened up a whole world of going oh man, because we don't see them move, we don't get the feeling of how they really operate. And so one of the ones that we work on at the moment, we can get back to how I ended up working in this area, but one of the things we work on at the moment is that we can genetically engineer plants in order to produce proteins that are made by other organisms, right? The classic world of genetic engineering. And so this is going to sound a bit weird for a while, but just roll with it for a while, and then it will get back to that allows you to visualize what's going on.
Okay.
So there are jellyfish, right? Now it's got weird because we're talking about jellyfish.
Wait a minute.
Some jellyfish are luminescent, right? So they just glow, and it's an internal glow from them. So they make, just like fireflies, they emit light.
Bioluminescence?
It's bioluminescence. There's a protein. The protein is energized by cellular energy, and then it goes click, and it does some chemistry, and that chemistry releases a photon of light, right? So some jellyfish do that. And there's lots of hand-wavy things about why the jellyfish would do it. And these are awesome stories of there's fish which are looking up and they see these twinkling lights and they go, oh, I'm looking at the stars, so there are no jellyfish to eat above me. Stories like that. But if you ignore why they do it and just go, oh, they do it. Mm-hmm. So there are these luminescent jellyfish. And so the machinery which is around it is that there is a protein that does the chemistry to emit light, and it actually emits blue light, but it turns out that the jellyfish glow green. And that is because there is another protein that sits right next to this luminescent protein, and that shifts the wavelength. So it does fluorescence. So it absorbs the blue light and emits green light, right? And it's one of the most awesome things in biology. The name is absolutely correct. It is called green fluorescent protein, right? GFP. And it truly is a big deal for biology. People got the Nobel Prize for working out how it works, because this green fluorescent protein just sits inside a cell, is made, folds itself up, and it is fluorescent. If you pump blue light into it, it will emit green light.
Oh, wow.
Right? And it's a protein, so there's a gene for it. And what the Nobel Prize world was working out, you could take the gene out of the jellyfish and put it in other organisms. So this has been done, you can literally do this. You can take that gene for green fluorescent protein, engineer it into a cat, and make a cat that when you shine blue light on it, glows green.
That's interesting.
And there's lots of good reasons why you'd want to do it. The cat one is kind of fun, right? But you can do it in plants. So I can take this green fluorescent protein and I can engineer a plant to make it, right? And so now if I shine blue light on that plant, it will glow green, which is a neat trick, but doesn't get you very far until you do one more step. And this is the mind-blowing thing that a group of sort of protein engineers worked out how to do. And so green fluorescent protein, physically, the way the protein works is it winds itself up into a thing that really does look like a barrel. And the chemistry bit that does the fluorescence is in the middle of the barrel. And the way to think about what the barrel is protecting this fluorescent bit. And so if you break that barrel, so you screw up the protein and break the barrel, it's no longer fluorescent. And so what some really very, very clever protein biochemists worked out how to do is they have the barrel and they break the barrel themselves. So they cut the protein in two, and now it doesn't work. And they join the two halves together with a protein hinge. And the protein hinge is made to respond to something. And so the one that we're super interested in is the calcium ion. And so this little bit of protein hinge joining these two things together, when calcium binds to it, levers the whole protein back together and it becomes fluorescent.
That's incredible. I can't believe that you're able to modify on that scale and get it to, because with me being an engineer, I'm thinking mechanically, electrically, right? But biology for me, that was one that I don't understand it as intuitively. And that's amazing to me that can be modified on that scale.
But you can put your engineering mindset in there. What a protein is a physical shape. It's a physical structure, and the structure is the thing that gives it its function. And what these protein engineers have done is work out how to build a machine that moves backwards and forwards.
That's incredible.
And when it moves forwards, it's fluorescent, and when it moves back, it's not fluorescent. So if you think what you've got now is a protein that glows bright green, in this case, when calcium levels go up. All right. So now we can get back to the original, how does that help you see what's going on? So that's a protein. So there's a gene for it, and I can engineer that protein into a plant. And it turns out that at a cellular level, changes in the level of calcium are just used by pretty much every piece of biology as a signal. So that at the moment, your heart is sitting there, and every time that the muscles of your heart contract, the thing that is triggering them to contract is that the cells in the muscle have a little spike in the level of calcium, and it goes up and it causes a muscle contraction, and then everything relaxes and another spike happens. And so the pacemaker of your heart, the natural pacemaker, is this little spike generating calcium area.
Interesting.
Or in your nerves, right? At the moment, you've got nerve conduction, and then you have a synapse that connects two nerves together. And the way that you were thinking is that the nerve impulse in one nerve is being passed through this gap, this synapse, to another nerve. And the chemical bridge that this nerve produces that signals to the other nerve is the calcium ion. It releases calcium. So changes in calcium are a big deal. Biology uses them, and generally there's a spike of calcium. That is a signal being transmitted.
Right? I see where this is going.
Yeah, so now we have plants where in real time we can see the calcium changes. And so you can go, well, what does it look like? And you might go, well, plants are kind of like fairly boring, right? They just sit there, and the time frame that we think that they respond over is like maybe hours to days to months.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have a caterpillar chewing on a leaf, and now you can see the leaf's calcium instantly as the jaws of the caterpillar close, the cells that are being damaged, they fire off calcium changes. Right? So the time frame is like instant. As soon as the information I'm being damaged appears, those cells go wah and like freak out, and those calcium changes are part of triggering defenses.
Mm-hmm.
But then what happens? The caterpillar chews a bit more, and then if you look at the leaf, the whole leaf lights up. A big wave of calcium moves across the leaf. And then, there's a stalk at the base of the leaf. It goes down the stalk, and then it goes into the stem of the plant, and then it radiates out across the rest of the plant. And the time frame is like a minute.
Wow.
So you chew on the plant, and the rest of the plant knows it's being damaged in 60 seconds.
That's incredible.
So it changes how you think plants work, because now, because you can see it, you can go, are they listening to us? If I touch them, do they know I've touched them? And they have these sensory systems, and they work in our time frame.
That's interesting.
See them.
Well, there was I don't know if you saw the study where, I might get this wrong a little bit, but it was basically they took like radioactive isotopes and they put them into trees, and then they were able to kind of track, let's say, communication between trees. It like forms a network, and then people start extrapolating, saying like, oh my God, they're communicating, and they start assigning human qualities to thinking and communicating. And I think that's a little bit on the stretch side, but it is interesting to see. It's interesting to see them interacting in ways that we, like you said previously, we could never visually see, and now that we can do that changes the way we think about him. It's almost like not MRI. What's the one where you can read people's brains? That's
the CT scans.
Yeah. It's like you can see different parts of the brain lighting up due to different responses. That's really interesting.
Yeah. I mean, that tree to tree communication, that is awesome because of what it's called. That is the Wood Wide Web. But like you say, I think so inevitably we use the language that we describe about how we work and how we think and how we communicate to try and describe how plants are working. And that how else are we going to do it? That's how we understand the world. And so of course we're going to use the language that we use to describe it. The pitfall is to then extrapolate to the plant being us and doing exactly the things that we do. And so then you get to talk about things like, oh, that plant's thinking about something. Well,
it feels pain.
Yeah. And those are awesome shorthand to describe a big theme about what you're looking at. But, pain is a very, very specific thing about how it's processed, and it's an experience, and it's damage and things like that. And some of that doesn't apply to plants because they don't have the same equipment to do it.
Yeah, there's a difference between pain being the signal, but then there's suffering, which is like the meaning you associate with the pain.
Yeah.
And so
it's all down to like there are great metaphors that we can use for how we work to experience how other biology is operating, and you just have to be careful not to take them too far.
So that brings up there's two places I want to go, and I want to go to the space side soon. But one question I have with what you just said there was, can that pollute your thinking if you're applying these human tendencies, these qualities? Can that actually kind of delude or pollute how you're thinking about like running your experiments? And does that cause problems for discovering new things because you're thinking about it in the wrong way?
I think 99% of scientists understand the fact that these are just like metaphors and shorthands, and molecular and cellular machineries. They're a great parallel. You know, some parts of the biochemistry of a plant are almost identical to the biochemistry of a human. You know, so there are great parallels. And biology, when biology works out how to do something really well, it tends to just stick to using it in lots of different cases. But there have to be differences as well. And I think pretty much everyone knows that.
Mm-hmm.
And the people who push the limits of the metaphor, a lot of times are pushing the limits to just see at what point it breaks.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, are plants intelligent? Well, if you say they think like humans, you clearly have, like, that's not there because they don't have the machinery that we have. But can I use that word intelligence to sort of convey the shorthand idea that it is
Processing information. Yeah.
And using that information and combining information to give you like adaptations? Well, then, yeah, and nobody would argue that plants take in information, process it, and do some pretty awesome stuff.
Right. Well, so speaking of awesome stuff, then okay, there's a lot of interesting stuff here about plants. Clearly, you're interested. So where does the space side come in? At what point do you decide that that's where like that's a really interesting interaction or like cross, right? And that opens up some really interesting avenues. How did you end up crossing the two?
It is so. I'm the front man for a lot of really like awesome people who work in the lab. But the kind of questions that we are all interested in are this one of how do you take in information and what's the machinery that lets you process that information and do something as being a plant. And so there's a lot of stimuli that you can talk about. And so one of them, now this is going to sound very, very much like this is the space stuff, but this is an avenue that's sort of going to get us close to space, but it won't quite get us in space. One of the questions that I've been interested in for a really long time. So I finished my PhD, I do a postdoc, and then I get my first lab. Right? And one of the things that is just a really annoying question, because we don't know the answer, is how do plants know up from down? Like, you know up from down, and I can tell you exactly the machinery that you have sitting inside your ear that allows you to monitor acceleration. I can even tell you the genes that encode the proteins that build that machinery.
Interesting.
But if I go for plants, I can't tell you that. And at the moment, we don't know. And it's been Charles Darwin actually wrote a book about plant biology. He did his evolution thing, and then he did his plant thing. And he described roots growing down and shoots growing up in as good a detail as you could ever want. It still nails it.
Mm-hmm.
But what is the machinery inside the cells of the plant that allow that to occur? We don't know. And we still don't know. And we've been working on it for a long time. And I think it's a fascinating question. And we have lots of ideas about how it works, and clearly every time that we've had an idea, it's been wrong because we don't know how it works.
Interesting, yeah.
But that's a very NASA-y sort of question, right? And so I got funded. NASA funds basic research, not going into space or anything like that, but things related to what NASA should be interested in. They have grants which will fund research on that. And so they funded the gravity sensing stuff. One of the things that happens when you get funded by NASA is you go to NASA meetings, like science meetings, and you start hanging out with like the engineers, and you start to hear about how rockets work, and you absorb this other world. Right. And so another project that we have in the lab, this is again nothing to do with space. This is a very fundamental question. One of the other things I would like to know is, when a field gets flooded, the plant knows it's been flooded, and it triggers a whole bunch of biochemistry and things that let it survive.
Oh wow!
And it eventually it's going to die for the same reason that if I flood you, eventually you die.
Don't your cell walls burst?
No, you run out of oxygen.
Oh, interesting.
You literally suffocate, right? And so plants will drown for the same reason that you will drown. Like that, eventually water doesn't have enough oxygen in it to support the biochemistry of being alive. So I'm also super interested in that. So we have research to try and work out how does the plant know that it's covered with water. So now this is the space bit. Those two worlds are now going to collide. And it's just
Mm.
serendipity. A lot of science is just right place at the right time and making the connection. So here's one of the crazy bits of being in space, right? On Earth, if I have a watering can and I tip it on its side, water comes out. But that is driven by gravity. Gravity is pulling the water down. And then the water hits the soil and the water disappears into the soil. But again, that's the water is being pulled down by gravity. And so you go into space and that doesn't occur. So if I have a watering can in space and I tip it on its side, nothing happens.
Mm.
All right? So when you water plants in space, the direction that the water moves is not going to be driven by gravity. But pretty much on Earth, it's all driven by gravity. If you have a mental picture of like the ocean or a stream or a faucet or a hose or a glass of water and drinking it, all of those movements are driven by gravity. So that's now all gone. So what are you left with? You're left with surface tension and capillary forces.
Mm.
So that's what dominates the movement of water in space. Right? So let's imagine you're watering a plant. And we can do it with a syringe because we have to pump the water now. That water hits the soil. And now the things that are going to make it move are not like percolation draining through the soil. It's going to stick to the soil particles, and then capillary forces are going to make it creep.
Mm.
And so I always say the great way to think of water in space is it is sticky and creepy.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's going to creep to the plant root. And if you have just a little bit too much water, and so that's pretty much always going to be the case, it's going to stick to the plant root, and then it's going to creep over the surface of the plant root. And then if you have a little bit more water, it will start creeping up the stem of the plant. And eventually you get a plant which is encased in water.
Does it just evenly distribute over, like, does it create an even layer over the entire surface?
It's driven by how hydrophilic or hydrophobic, how much the water wants to bond to the surface or not. But like you'll get a layer of water sticking to the surface of it. So if you think about that plant in space is now flooded purely by watering it. And so we find out that that is a big deal about being in space from hanging out with the spacey people by doing this gravity project, and then just go, we work on that already. We work on that in the context of flooding of plants. And so in the work on flooding, like just flooding of plants on the ground, we have some genetic engineering tricks that we do where we can change how the plant sensing systems work, and we can make plants which are resistant to flooding stress. So
that's really interesting.
And so then you just go like, okay, serendipity puts these two questions next to each other, and we think we know an answer to the problem of spaceflight because we can genetically engineer plants to be better at coping with that environment. So the first spaceflight that we did was on SpaceX 2, which is like crazy awesome to be on. Like,
that's awesome.
Actually, the first like real experimental commercial spaceflight on CRS-2, and we put mutants of the plant that we work on, this plant, mouse-eared cress. We grew them in space to ask the question about, did they grow better in space, and was there sort of a fingerprint that you could pick up that plants really are acting like they're drowning while they're in space. So it was just all of the things coming together. That's how we ended up doing it.
That's awesome.
The more you hang out with the spacey people, and the more that you understand about space, the more the really interesting and slightly crazy world of space gives you questions that you can approach. And the only place you're ever going to get the answers is in space.
That's really interesting, because I just, as you were saying that was making me think about when you're trying to solve new problems, you have to question what your assumptions are. And there are some things when you're on Earth that you just take for granted, whether it's being human or the way we live. And so when you put yourself into space, all of those assumptions about the environment you're in now instantly change. And I imagine that creates an entirely new way of thinking about what exactly is going on.
Yeah. And it's one of those things. There are a lot of things about the space flight environment, especially its impact on biology, Some of them you could totally guess. Like I don't think it would take. There's no great leap to go. Oh, you know what happens to the astronauts in space? Their muscles start to wither away because they don't have to work against weight anymore.
Multiple sunrises.
Yeah, and like your day-night cycle is going to be screwed up. Like there are some things which I think like you can just guess, and then there are some things which I think when you are told they occur, you go like, "Oh yeah," but like they're not the things you're ever going to guess. And some of those are these just underlying assumptions that sit around in our brain, and we don't know we're making them. So one of the other ones, which is really kind of crazy to think about, is so we'll have to think a little bit about like being on Earth, and then we'll go into space and go like, oh, none of that's going to happen anymore. So hot air balloons, right? That's a great place to start. Hot air balloons rise because the hot air expands, and then it's less dense. So it kind of like it weighs less than the cold air around it. And so a hot air balloon rises because it's basically the less dense hot air is floating on the more dense cold air. And so that's classic buoyancy. It's the reason that ships float is the ship is less dense than the water.
Right.
But the reason that occurs is because of density. And in space, that's a weight-related thing, right?
Gravity,
and in space, doesn't count. So now you can go like, oh, now somebody's told me that. What's not going to work in space? All right, so ships don't float. Like if you had a water and a boat, and I don't know why you'd ever do this, but if you had a water and a boat in space, the boat won't float, all right, because the density differences don't make any differences.
That's really interesting.
There was a movie called Passengers a few years ago, and at one
point, don't think I've seen it.
Yeah, it's an interesting movie. Let's put it that way. But at one point, there's somebody swimming in a swimming pool in space, and they have artificial gravity, and the artificial gravity fails, right? And they're inside this ball of water, and they swim out, right? So you're gonna die. Like that's just not that. You can't swim out of it, right? There's no density difference between you and the water.
Oh, so you can't push yourself.
And also remember, in space, water is sticky and creepy. So if you open your mouth, the water will stick to your face and then creep down inside you. Right?
Oh, and you can't get it out.
Drown. It's a bizarre place to think about.
That's insane. I've never thought about that.
So
that's crazy.
Here's the one which impacts a lot on biology. That is because there's no buoyancy, and it's going to be related to gases, right? And so that hot air balloon rose because it was less dense, right? So hot air rises. That's convection. That's the movement of the movement of gases powered by density differences, which are due to differences in temperature, right? And so you have convection. There is no convection in space because the density differences don't matter. So now all hell is going to break loose. So let's say that you pull out your cell phone, right? The battery in your cell phone gets warm as you're using it, and it gets cooled because of convection. The hot air around the battery rises away from the battery, bringing in cool air. So that doesn't occur in space.
Yeah.
So your cell phone gets hotter and hotter and hotter.
Yeah, this is something I've worked with some aerospace electronics, avionics and stuff. And so that's a huge concern for flight computers, right? Which is how do we pull heat away from all of our processors and everything? Because like what you just said, you don't have air passing over it to cool it down.
Yeah. So you can do it with a fan. That's like the classic way. NASA would call that forced convection. They just blow a fan over it. All right. So that's like electronics. Do the same thing with biology, right? So let's say that I have a plant with a light above it, and I switch the light on. That light now irradiates the leaf, and the leaf absorbs that energy, and it's using it for photosynthesis and building sugars and the things that plants do to stay alive. But some of the energy, actually quite a lot of the energy of the light, is absorbed by the leaf, and it turned into heat. And so the leaf gets a little bit warmer. But the leaf can cool itself, and it basically sweats. It releases water vapor, and the water vapor gets carried away by convective air movement, and that cools the surface of the leaf. But so that doesn't occur in space. So
Oh, so
if
you just cook it.
you just cook it, yeah, you
Oh,
switch the
wow.
lights on and you cook your plant. So you have to have fans. Right now, if you don't have fans, things just get hotter and hotter and hotter. But now, go down into the soil. And so this is the bit where you have to start being a plant biologist as well, to know a few things about how plants work. So we always think of plants doing photosynthesis. The light comes on, they make sugars, and the waste byproduct of photosynthesis is oxygen. So they take in carbon dioxide and they release oxygen and they make sugars, and that's what photosynthesis is. That's 100% correct. But when you go down into the roots, the roots aren't green. The roots don't do photosynthesis. So the way that the root system stays alive is it respires just like you are respiring at the moment. It uses oxygen, it burns sugars, it makes cellular energy, and that's what keeps it alive. So now think of being in the soil, and you've got a root which is using up oxygen. And there are actually, convection is everywhere on the earth. Like if there's a thermal difference, there will be a convection current built up. And so there's convective movement of gases through the soil. And so on Earth, roots use up oxygen, but the gas spaces in the soil are always being mixed up. And so there's always new oxygen being brought in. But now go into space. You're using up oxygen, you're growing in the soil, and there's no resupply of oxygen because the oxygen's just being used up, and there's no churning of atmosphere through the soil because there's no convection. So you use up the oxygen. And so you end up with an area around the root where there is no oxygen.
You're suffocating it effectively.
So you just suffocate by being alive. It is a crazy thing to think about.
So how does, sorry, don't mean to interrupt you, but one question I kind of had, and this kind of goes into it actually, which is right now, like I think on the ISS, they're using electrolysis, right? To produce, basically passing electric current through water to produce oxygen. And that's how they produce. So my question is, if you have a large enough set of plants, can you use that kind of for scrubbing the air and recycling and using that as a oxygen source? Or does that need to be like a massive scale in order to be useful?
No, you're absolutely right. So this is a thing called a bioregenerative life support system. And the idea is that we can do engineering. Like we can make oxygen with engineering, we can scrub CO2 with an engineering chemistry approach. But the question is, how sustainable is that? And especially on really long distance flights, like a mission to Mars, it takes you 9 months to get to Mars. So we're never think of really long-term engineering solutions. How sustainable is the engineering? And so then people take a step back and go, well, do we know of life support systems that are very, very long-term and are very sustainable? And there is only one that we know about, and that's the Earth, right? And we're pretty happy that that is a long-term regenerative life support system, and it actually works pretty well. And so the basis of the life support component of the Earth is pretty much the plant biology. And so you totally can take that idea and go, well, if we want to keep people alive for a long period of time on a long duration exploration mission, maybe we have to use the thing we know that works, and that would be plants. And then you can have the engineering component to it. How much? Is it at all feasible? Do in reality, we need 20 acres of plants to keep one human being alive?
Right.
And it turns out, no. Photosynthesis is mind-blowingly good. And so the Russians actually did an enclosed test where they had a couple of cosmonauts in an enclosed life habitat thing. And they had plants in there, just a few square meters of things like wheat, and it actually produces too much oxygen. And so your issue is the oxygen concentration is potentially going too high. And once you get up into the 30% oxygen, you're in the flashpoint for a lot of materials. And so fires become a big deal. So the plant biology is pretty amazing. And the other flip side of that is that can you feed people? Like, could you use it at that level? And so those people do very intensive hydroponic farming. And that's about as productive as you can get at the moment. And with those 52 square meters, of plants becomes self-sustaining as far as a human being is concerned.
Wow.
So 52 square meters is not a crazy enormous amount of space. It's pretty big, like for space flight, I would agree. At the moment, that is like, we're not going to do that. But it's not so big that you could never imagine doing it.
Right.
And then the third bit of it, which is the sort of okay, it's all sounding too good to be true at the moment. Like we could scrub CO2, we could produce oxygen. You can actually use plants to purify your water as well. So basically you pass water, the plants have water passing through them. And you can put crappy water in at the bottom and you get pure water coming out the top.
Does that damage the plant?
Well, depends what you mean by like poor water quality.
Yeah, okay, sure.
But yeah, no, like they are, plants are pretty robust. So yeah, and you can make your food. So it just sounds like, well, but that's what we do on the earth. So it's like not such a crazy idea. However, the issue becomes you're going to rely on it, right? And on Earth, we have things like crop failures, and we have outbreaks of pathogens. And the reason that it works is because we have an enormous area to play with, and agriculture is just every time I read about how much food is made by how many people, you can just take the step back and go like in the United States, agriculture is just unbelievably productive. It's just amazing. Like I was going to say none of us, very, very few of us are farmers.
Not anymore.
But the farmers produce enough food to feed everyone. It's there's a lot of productivity, and so when things get screwed up, we have a bit of a buffer built in. And that buffer's getting smaller all the time, and it's like there's food shortages, and depending on where you live in the world, like that stable production of food is not necessarily true.
Right.
But the productivity is there. But if you are relying on it, you got to rely on it. And so that is the conundrum at the moment. That if we went for this sort of bio-based life support system, it can't go wrong. And so that reliability bit of it is a big challenge at the moment. But same thing if you went with the engineering solution, and let's just say that you were going to use electrolysis of water to produce oxygen, you have the same thing. It can't go wrong. Like you have to have the backup, otherwise, because
well, in the same way,
to Mars, you should not be a one-way trip.
In the same way that you were saying that your plants are going to take up a large amount of space, you have to carry a lot of water then if you're going to be, and that's heavy. That's a lot of weight you got to carry. This section here, this brought up a couple of questions, but one of the things I want to ask you about is the movie The Martian, because a lot of what we just talked about is off-gassing and farming and creating food and using that for sustainability. How you've seen the movie, right?
Oh, totally, yeah.
How much did they get right, and how much was like you had to suspend your disbelief? Because one thing, like I watch a lot of movies now, and I love science fiction and all that stuff. And one of the things is, like, again, as an engineer, I know how a lot of stuff works, and so sometimes you're like, okay, you took some liberties here, and I understand what you did. And so for you watching that movie, did you have to suspend your disbelief, or did they get a lot of things right?
It was pretty good. I mean, so the worst thing, the worst group of people to watch a space movie, which is not like Star Wars, but like one where they're trying to put the technology in and try and make it like
modern day,
more realistic. Yeah. The worst group of people are a bunch of space people, right?
Yeah.
So we watched The Martian, and very, very few places did you go like fake. Yeah. They got a lot of it correct. I mean, it's a movie, so
right.
There have to be bits of it where reality would be so boring that you were never going to make it into a movie. But a lot of it was pretty good. There's some elements of the plant biology component of it where you go, oh, that's just never going to work. But a lot of it was pretty close, even down to things like growing potatoes. That's not. That might seem like that seems a bit crazy, but that is not as crazy as you think it is for like nutrition. the one of the issues with Mars is because of the chemistry of the regolith, like the soil. There are actually quite a lot of plant toxins sitting in the soil. And so if you just did, what Mark Watney did, which is just basically shovel it into a room, pour some water on it, and then stick your plants in it, that probably is just not going to work because your plants are all going to die. But the remediation that people are talking about is not as hard as you might imagine, like, because there's a lot of the issues that we predict for Martian regolith for being like compatible with like terrestrial biology are related to the accumulation of soluble chemicals. And so you could wash the soil. And there is water
could you like filter
Mars,
it?
so you could basically, you would basically have some approach where you could basically use the water that's available to clean up the Martian soil to the point of where it wouldn't be as toxic.
You could like separate out the solid chunks.
Yeah. But then there's some bits of it of the Martian where. So one of the things about the regolith, the dust and the rocks, the soil component of it, is that because there's no weathering on either the moon or Mars, the particles of like sand on Earth get weathered, and so the jaggedy points of them over time get rounded off. And so that's, and weathering is pretty much everywhere on the planet. So we have a lot of rounded off bits of rock that make up like soils and stuff like that. On the moon and Mars, there is no weathering. And so the jaggedy bits stick there. And so the particles that make up the soil, like this regolith in those places, is very sharp.
Oh, interesting.
And so that now it becomes a purely engineering thing. All right. So if you are an astronaut wandering around on the surface of the moon, you're getting coated in this dust. And on Earth, the dust might not be such a big deal, but it gets into things. And because it is so sharp, it starts to abrade and gum up things.
Oh,
and
interesting.
So one of the limitations on the length of duration of the missions for the Apollo was that the spacesuits started to get gunged up with the dust. And so, if you can't bend your joints, you can't stay.
Yeah.
So one of the bits where we're all sitting there, we're all the space biologists, we're all watching The Martian, and it's just awesome. And then one of the bits where everyone just looks at each other and goes, thanks, is there's the Martian vehicle, the rover that he gets into, and he opens the door and climbs inside, and he's just like, it's never going to happen because now it is full of Martian regolith, and all the buttons are going to stop working, and all the switches won't be able to be moved. And so there has to be the way that NASA is planning to do it for the moon is and Mars, there's this thing called suit ports. Your spacesuit is hung on the outside of the rover, and there's basically got a little door in the back of it, and you climb into it, shut the door, and then unhook yourself from the rover, wander around, and then when you want to get back in the rover, you hook yourself back onto the rover, open the door, and climb inside the rover, so that the rover is never open to the so there's lots of stuff like that, which is like, but the cool thing about the Martian was that for a very, very short period of time, being a botanist was one of the coolest things in the world.
I was gonna say, how did for a majority of your life have you had challenges with that then, where it wasn't considered cool or kind of seemed kind of far out there as to like, do we really need to be doing this? And then the moment it goes into space, everyone goes, oh, I understand why we need to do it and why this is important now.
No, I mean, I don't think anyone who's a plant researcher really ever goes down the road of like, oh, what I'm working on, people don't think it's cool enough.
Right.
Because almost, like if you're a university researcher, being a professor is one of these crazy jobs. It's one of the most awesome jobs in the world because you are basically paid to be interested in something.
Mm.
And so the thing you're working on is just going to be the thing that sort of consumes you because it's just these fascinating questions that you want to get the answers to.
Well, it's interesting because from what you were saying, it sounds like there's an endless list of questions and problems to solve. When you solve one problem and then you move on and then you're faced with another problem. And like you said, you solve the water problem and then suddenly you turn your light on and you just cooked your plant. And now you have to solve that problem. And that opens up like it seems like an almost endless pit of problems to just keep solving. But humans seem to enjoy that. So
yeah. And then and then there are some where so NASA has a group of things which we call showstoppers, right? And those are things that will happen in space that could be a reason that humans can't do long distance, long term exploration of space. And so there are some really, really big ones which are on the horizon that we have to understand and work out if we can solve them. One of them is radiation. You go away from the Earth. We are protected on the Earth by the Earth's magnetic field from the background galactic cosmic radiation. And once you go out into space, you just get hit by it. And I always go, it's not like in the movies, like rip your face off radiation. It's not that kind of radiation. Radiation is very energetic, fairly low dose, but you just accumulate a lot of it over time. And so, and we don't know what's going to happen, right? Because the Earth protects us from it. It's a great place to live. And so there's those really big questions where, the research sort of lens is now moving to those because they really are the thing at the moment that we have to understand because they're going to dictate how we're going to do space. Like we want to put astronauts in space. That's one of the big deals. And things like radiation are going to dictate how we do that.
Yeah.
And they're huge unknowns at the moment. It's so cool because it's an unknown.
Oh yeah. Well, and again, I'm looking at it from just the electrical and mechanical side of things and like some of the problems that they had to solve just to get rovers to Mars and get them to operate and you can't fix them. Like they have to be autonomous, like all this stuff. I'm looking at it from that side going, these are some insane challenges that people have worked on. But then again, from the biology side, in the same way you have to make plants survive, you have to make humans survive, like that to me, the mechanical stuff, I don't want to say is easy, but comparatively to keeping a thing alive seems much more challenging.
But this is the one of the really awesome bits of like if you work in the space realm, if you're a biologist working in the space realm, the reality is that you have to do the biology and the engineering. Like space is this place where these things have to come together.
Yeah.
And the solutions are you got to understand the biology well enough to know what you need to do, but then the engineering solutions are got to be there as well. And putting them together, that interface is a tremendous amount of fun because you get to do these crazy engineering solutions to overcome a biological limitation.
Have you felt like this experience, especially over the last decade, 2 decades, whatever, like do you feel like you've become like more humble by the experiences because you're just constantly faced with the fact that you don't know? Like you can't, a lot of people I think in today's day and age are like they want to feel confident, they know what they're doing, they're what they're talking about. But one thing I found with engineering is like I'm constantly faced with challenges that have never been solved. And so at some point you have to be humble about it because you don't know. And so what's that experience been like for you?
I think that's true. That what spaceflight experimentation tells you is that a lot of stuff you just don't know the answer to, but you can work your way towards it, and you may not ever get the answer, but at least you can make those steps. And the other thing is, which is very obvious in the area of people who do spaceflight, is that everyone knows it's incredibly hard. Like things go wrong. Like we've had friends who, they had stuff on rockets and the rockets are blown up. It's like, so there's a lot of, and just the logistics of how you do a spaceflight experiment are complicated, and it requires a ton of people, and all those people have to work together. And it is totally a team, and the team is full of people with immensely deep knowledge of the thing that they do. And if you don't have all of those people working together, it's just never going to work.
Right.
But so what that ends up leading to is that people are incredibly collaborative and helpful and will bend over backwards to make something work, because absolutely everyone knows that if you don't do that, you're not going to get into space.
Yeah.
So yeah, and everyone is very very cognizant of the fact you might be wrong.
Yeah.
Your idea, you think you know how it works, but everyone is up front, this idea just might be completely wrong, but we're going to go and test it.
Again, it comes back to those initial assumptions, which are like, I'm solving all these problems, but that's with the assumption that I'm on the earth being a human acting in this way. And suddenly you go into space and you're like, oh crap, there's a whole bunch of things we never, you learn from your mistakes, hopefully, and then you go and improve on it and iterate. And hopefully you do that enough times where at some point you run out of things to be wrong about.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing is that it is immense amount of fun. Everyone is enjoying it because it's space flight stuff. You get to play with rockets and things like that. And so everyone wants it to work because everyone is totally having a ball doing it.
Oh, yeah. So I want to be cognizant of your time here. I guess I have kind of one more question for you, which is like, if you have to give any advice to either high school, college students about pursuing their career, because one thing I've been thinking about recently, I've been out of school for 3 years and I've gone through some career changes, trying to figure out what I really want to do, what do I want to pursue, what do I want to work hard at. Any advice to students about either trying new things or just kind of how to think about their career as they kind of progress, and obviously as you've been working on something this long?
Yeah, I think the reality of it is that the things that you find fascinating and the things that you find engaging, if you can make that your career, you have won, right? Because then you're working on it's not a job anymore. It's just like the stuff that you do because this is what you love doing. So that is that's the tricky thing to find. What do you love doing? That might change. So a great example is within the world of biology, right? So I actually teach one of the big introductory biology classes at Madison, and we have 1,000 students, and the freshmen come in, freshmen, sophomores, they take those classes as a prelude to taking the other classes, which are going to sort of equip them with the tools to do the career that they want to do. And many of the incoming 1,000 students, it's a biology class, and many of them, when they come in, think that they want to be doctors. And that's great. And a lot of them will do it. But during their time at the university, many of the people who come in thinking that they want to be a doctor or a pharmacist, something like that, find something else in the university and then go like, no, this is what I'm going to do. And they discover this thing, and just knowing that you're allowed to do that. You might have all of your life thought that you were going to, from the age of 10, I knew I wanted to be a doctor. And then I find out that medieval history is so engaging and awesome. That's what I want to do. Knowing that you're allowed to do that, you're allowed to change your mind and find new things. That is the sort of the biggest thing. Just experience a lot of stuff and find the thing that sticks.
Yeah, that resonates a lot because it's hard work finding what you enjoy, but if you can do it, then like you have your entire life. So if you're not going to spend it trying to find the things you enjoy, like what's the point?
Yeah.
So awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks a lot. I learned a lot from this conversation. I had a great time talking with you, and it was really interesting to pick your brain on again, I don't study much biology. I don't pay too much attention to it. And so getting the experience to talk to you about that has been really, really interesting. So thanks for taking your time.
No, I had a ball as well, Walt. So thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, anytime. I hope you have a great rest of your weekend.
Yeah, you too. All righty.
Thanks for listening to my conversation with Dr. Simon Gilroy. I hope you guys learned something interesting about plants in space, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks for listening.